Outside the tattered fence line, sunrise seeped across the prairie like a recollection too burdensome to set aside. Weston Hale stirred before sparrows could start their morning song, just as he had for 9 dismal years. His boots sank into the same tired grooves on the porch, his gaze drifting toward the same charred shadow of the barn that burned to ashes years before. The land lay broad enough to encompass a man's isolation, and perhaps that was why he'd never departed. He had convinced himself there was dignity in remaining, though there were mornings, when the wind crept through the cracks of the siding, as cold as fingers against his cheekbones, that he questioned whether it wasn't dignity that held him here, but fear. Fear of being found. Fear of allowing another to look beyond his courteous nods and discover the emptiness behind his ribs. He had constructed this life to bar others, and it had succeeded until that morning. She stumbled up the long dirt road, step hampered by some personal disaster. Her skirts caught on dry clumps of grass, and against the infinite sky, she seemed too small to exist. She was not riding a horse, nor driving a wagon. She had only a dilapidated bundle pressed tightly to her breast. For an instant, Weston suspected she was a mirage, created from his need for companionship. But then she jerked her head up and the bruises spoke for themselves. Dark flowers along her jaw, a crusted cut of dried blood beside her temple. Her eyes didn't even blink when they met his. It was the expression of someone who had nothing left to lose, and in that they were family. A question occurred to him, unwanted but unescapable. What would compel a woman to travel this far alone at sunrise? If not need, he did not stir to assist her. Not yet. Sympathy, he had discovered, could be as hard as indifference. So he merely stood by and let her make her way up onto the porch, supporting herself on the post. Her fingers were scraped red, her nails rimmed with dust. When she did finally speak, her voice was so low he almost didn't catch it. "Please, just for a night. I need a place to stay." They sounded practiced, smoothed over by miles. Weston looked at her, balancing the risk of deception. But what thief drove up with bruises they didn't even bother to disguise? What liar's lips shook so violently when they were speaking? She swayed, and he was too quick to think before his hand was on her elbow. "Sit," he whispered, the sound of his own voice making him jump. "You look close to falling." She collapsed onto the top step, the bundle in her lap like a child. Weston knelt beside her, not wanting to alarm her any further. The copper smell of dried blood clung to her, mixed with the dust of the road. Her hair had come undone from its pins, a ragged braid sliding over the shoulder. He found himself wondering if she had been beautiful once, before fear hollowed her eyes. He wondered why he cared. "I'm not here to trouble you," she said at last, steadier now. "I just can't go any farther tonight." "What's your name?" "Elakar." She met his gaze without apology. "I walked from White Willow. My husband, he won't come looking." She didn't elaborate and Weston didn't press. He was too familiar with the language of departure to require the specifics. Still, something within him writhed pity or remembrance of seeing your life go up in flames while you remained helpless. He rose and held out his hand.
"I'm Weston Hale."
"The hearth is yours for the evening. No questions."
"No judgment."
Her fingers were cold like river rocks when she put them in his. Relief flared in her eyes for an instant like a flicker of flame, before fatigue drew her lids down once more. He escorted her in, both of them sensing how the door threshold seemed to protest their entry. This was not a place for visitors, and the house understood that. The boards creaked in alarm beneath her step as if they, too, were not familiar with strangers. Weston led her to the ancient armchair beside the cold hearth and laid her bundle on the braided rug. She wrapped herself into the frayed cushions as if attempting to fade away. He stood there, transfixed, for what seemed a long time, watching her slow breathing, the delicate rhythm of someone who'd run too far, too hard. Then, wordlessly, he brought a tin cup of water and placed it at her side. He could sense something in him awakening, ancient instincts from a life when he used to know how to tend to someone. He near resented how easily they returned. And when he gazed at her, there was no loathing, only a curious, aching tenderness that filled him with caution for himself. Outside, the dawn had fully broken, cold and raw as a fresh wound. Later, when she awoke, she forced the cup into water and folded the tattered quilt he'd thrown over her shoulders with exactness. There was a sense of wariness in every gesture, as if disarray itself would shatter her fragile grip on things. Weston comprehended. Following the fire, he'd sat for hours lining his boots, straightening a slanted frame. Bereavement required something tangible to grasp. She spoke little, provided only murmurs of thanks in a tone softer than the settling of the rocker. Weston caught himself creating chores, patrolling the fence line, surveying the horizon. Not because he needed to, but to allow her space to collect herself into shards. And yet, whenever he returned inside, he felt her presence alter the silence. The house was not brighter precisely, but it was populated, and for a moment he'd forgotten. On the third morning, he discovered her outdoors, face raised to the sun. Her bruises had turned pale yellow and green, her stance less guarded. He observed her quiet defiance in her chin from the porch. She must have sensed his attention because she turned and confronted it without blanching. "You were right," she whispered. "I don't think he's coming after me." He nodded. He'd known from the beginning. A man who allowed his wife to walk 20 miles in the dark would not risk the scandal of pursuing her. But her fear, he knew, would take much longer to mend than her wounds. "You can stay," he said before he could change his mind. "If you want." She paused, her gaze seeking his for the reason he'd do such a thing when he so obviously treasured his isolation. But she didn't inquire and he didn't clarify. Some things were better left unsaid. From that morning, a pattern started to develop. She claimed the kitchen with unspoken intent, baking flatbread that filled the air with the very faint smell of home. He showed her how to saddle the gray mare, her hands shaking the first time she got hold of the reins. They talked of nothing that had ever been, only of minor matters: the form of the clouds, the cost of flour in town, the sound of the wind whistling through the stovepipe. But every evening, when the fire smoldered low and shadows crept, Weston felt reassured by the sound of her breathing in the adjacent room. The tranquility was not lost on everyone. One afternoon, a deputy crow rode up, his eye keen as he looked from Weston to Ella. "People are saying," the deputy replied, voice soft but biting, "a woman with no family, a man who is a loner. Don't take much for rumors to get legs." Weston did not glance aside. "Let them." "You sure about that?" Crow asked. Weston folded only his arms and glared back until the deputy spat in the dust and rode away. The silence he left was an accusation and a promise. When Weston turned to Ella, she was standing in the doorway, pale. "I can go," she breathed, "if it's too much trouble." "No," he snapped, then gentler. "No, I don't want you to." The words surprised them both. He saw her shoulders tremble, her lips part as if she'd been bracing every day for him to send her away. She had been waiting for rejection as surely as she once waited for blows. "I'm not afraid of their talk," he added. "Are you?" She hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "I'm tired of being afraid. Of everything." Her honesty pierced him, hitting something he believed long dead. Without the ability to stop himself, he grasped for her hand. Her fingers closed into his, not a vow, not a promise, but more than each had ever ventured thus far. The wind shook the loose shutter, but they didn't budge. He could feel the rapid beat of her pulse and the question between them. What if they were to cease fleeing from their past? That evening, much later when she'd slept in the chair near the fire, Weston stood in the doorway and gazed out over the vast prairie. The sky was raw and endless, and it was full of potential he had been blind to for so long. He remembered the life he'd reduced to ashes, the years spent half convincing himself loneliness was sufficient. And he realized then, grace didn't always come heralded by trumpets or forgiveness. Sometimes it slipped in softly, scorched and exhausted, with nothing but a bruised package and a heart that was still beating. He shut the door quietly, the latch clicking like the final note of a hymn, and for the first time in years he did not fear the dawn. He wondered instead what it would feel like to awake to something greater than emptiness.